Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today, we're going to take a look at some of the major issues that were discussed at the United Nations in its recent session of the General Assembly. My guest is an expert on the United Nations. Dr. Robert Zuber is the Director of Global Action to Prevent War and Armed Conflict. Dr. Zuber also serves as a consultant advisor or board member to several nonprofit and educational organizations, including Green Map System and the Martin Luther King Jr. Center in Cameroon, just to mention a few. Dr. Robert Zuber, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Great to see you again, Bill.
Great to see you. Bob, before we get into what is happening during the 78th session of the General Assembly, let's talk just for a second about your website, it's Global Action PW.org. I got it out there, I think, globalactionpw.org, and the Global Action to Prevent War. What was the purpose of setting up that non-governmental organization?
Well, in 1999, before I was around, it was set up based on a program statement that had been developed to help the UN sort out its security-related responsibilities, including in the areas of weapons. And it was modestly successful, as was our initiative after that to establish something called a UN Emergency Peace Service, which was a standing rapid reaction capacity, which Sir Brian Urquhart, among others, picked up with us. It didn't come to pass directly, but like many things at the UN, it came to pass indirectly because more and more peacekeeping operations, including through the African Union, understood the basic tenet that, if you're protecting civilians and you don't arrive on time, you don't arrive. So it's like a fire department that waits 2 days before they show up at the scene of a fire. By the time they get there, the house is in embers and daisies are starting to grow in the soil. And so we pushed the rapid response mechanism, and since then we've focused a lot on intern training, especially interns from non-security related parts of the world. We do a lot with business students and other things, and also helping other organizations, especially NGOs, to get situated at the UN, because it's a baffling environment, to say the least. And the further away you are from headquarters, the more inscrutable it seems. And so being able to kind of ease people through that is important. That said, COVID decimated a lot of things, and it decimated a chunk of our capacity as well. So we've spent the last year or so, while a lot of organizations we work with have decided to kind of close shop or move on, we decided to go back with all the challenges of that. And I think it's been a good decision, but not an easy one for sure.
It certainly wouldn't be, no doubt about it. Well, I guess we should jump into the swamp, so to speak, and talk about all the issues that are out there, because we can see things are deteriorating in many areas of the world. One thing the UN, when it was set up in 1945, was set up to first eliminate the scourge of war, second, to promote economic and social development, and third, to enhance human rights around the world. It's been very successful in some areas. Some it hasn't been for a variety of reasons. But one item that the Secretary General Guterres has been talking about is this new agenda for peace. What exactly is that?
Well, it's one of the policy briefs that the Secretary General put out around the larger rubric of our common agenda, and it's a new agenda for peace. I've written about it some. Doug Roach, who's a friend of ours, has just put out a book where the new agenda features somewhat prominently. It's an interesting effort. It's a new agenda in the sense that so much has evolved. It doesn't have that much in common with the old agenda, aside from the concerns with nuclear disarmament. But and it does push a prevention agenda, which is easier said than done. It sounds great rhetorically. It's very difficult to enact in practice. But he is quite concerned about shifting the architecture of the UN so that it can do more horizon scanning and more sort of early warning and get ahead of some of these conflicts instead of running behind them, which is what we do a lot of the time. I mean, even in the case of this recent conflict in the Middle East with Israel and Hamas and Palestine, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this is such a long conflict. There's so much cause and effect that's gone on, and most of it has not been sufficiently addressed. I mean, there's been very little accountability over many years. There probably won't be a lot this time either. There were some things in the new agenda that I thought were really important, like pushing for an end to cluster munitions, which are particularly devastating and are part of that concern of weapons being launched at a distance and doing damage at a distance without us having to actually see the damage we're causing, which I think is a big problem. But there are also issues within the new agenda. I mean, on the one hand, the Secretary General talks about the UN as indispensable to peace, which I would be somewhat inclined to agree with. But at the same time, he's also made it very, very clear that in many respects, the UN simply has not delivered, and that the human rights agenda remains fraught, and the Sustainable Development Goals remain largely insufficiently addressed. We're not going to make most of our targets by 2030, no matter what they tell you. And the peace and security agenda is locked into some very arcane architecture, including the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Commission, the Disarmament Committee and the Committee on Disarmament, all of which are stuck in some very, very significant ways. That the global community is, I think, in some ways losing patience with.
And of course, the UN is like any other group, I guess. There's no other institution like it in the world.
No,
193 countries of the world come together. And of course, it's been said in the past, and I think it's true, that for the UN programs to be successful, it has to have support of the member states, especially the key states, and in particular, most or all of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council who have a veto power and who are the ones who can make or break or make changes or reform the UN to a large degree. But without that support, some programs will succeed because maybe governments get behind them or something like that. But is it practical to, I mean, we really have to put the blame. Apparently, Guterres, Secretary General Guterres, literally, I'll put it bluntly, read the Riot Act to the leaders of the world about a week ago, saying you're certainly not doing enough in coming together to deal with these problems, especially climate change. And of course, now in the United States, we've done a lot over the last 2 years in the area of climate change, and a lot more needs to be done. We need to do it more quickly. But what can he do? It's not a one world government. He's not a dictator. You can't tell them what to do. So how do you mobilize and get these folks on the ball and get them moving and to get them excited about trying to deal with these problems?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think the Secretary General is in a conundrum, maybe a little bit of his own making. He did in fact read the Riot Act. He reads the Riot Act to diplomats a lot. There was very little in his opening speech to the GA that was a departure from what he does much of the time. And there has been some blowback. One of which there were some meetings recently, including one featuring him, where he was talking about the Summit of the Future, and delegations, China, Indonesia, Egypt, there were several others, including some very big states, are concerned that he's pushing too hard on this notion of multi-stakeholder agendas and giving corporations, NGOs like me, other people, leading them to believe that they should have a larger say in matters that the UN deals with than we have. And the country pushback was, and I frankly am inclined to agree with the country pushback in the UN as it exists. And they were saying, look, these has to be intergovernmental processes. The governments pay the bills, the governments run the show, the governments make the rules, and who do NGOs represent specifically, and who do corporations represent? Well, I think that's fair. I'm not sure who I represent, half the time, except when we forge collaborations with organizations, with other constituents, but that doesn't give me a right to make decisions. It may give me the right to be in the building. So that's a real issue for the Secretary General. And then I think the second part of it is, Bill, honestly, we all have a shelf life, right? There's a point at which people don't want to listen to me anymore in my much smaller circles than the Secretary General has. And, there's a point at which, I just have to tone it down and be quiet for a while and let somebody else kind of take the podium and make the case. And I think that the SG is a little bit overexposed on some of these issues.
I agree with what you're saying, but the only thing is with the private sector in particular, and NGOs too, to a large degree, because they have folks who have great resources. And I'm not talking about financial, but I'm talking about human resources they can bring to bear on some of these problems. But the private sector almost has to be involved actively, especially with dealing with climate change and with some of the other problems too that we're dealing with. They have to be in the mix, or we'll never solve these problems. Government, what I'm saying is governments alone cannot solve it. I know you're not saying.
No, I'm not. And I agree with you entirely.
But I just wanted to throw that out. But
no, good. That's very good that you did. And I think it's really important in terms of the UN going forward with the next Secretary General, who, may possibly actually be a woman, because God knows there are candidates around who would be excellent at the job. But yeah, I think that the UN has got to sort out the difference between affecting or impacting the system, which we hope that we do as well, and being a decision maker in terms of what resolutions look like and who gets to put their stamp on those and that kind of thing. I don't feel that I have a role to play in terms of sitting in negotiation sessions where they're fussing over language. I don't think it's my place.
Right. No,
and I guess that's the distinction that I would want to make.
Exactly. I think you're absolutely right on that. No doubt about it. Yes. And of course, Secretary General Guterres, I think he's in a very difficult position because he sees what's happening to this planet. He gets some of the best information as to what climate change, the climate crisis, is doing to our planet. And I think he's ringing the alarm bells because he realizes that if we don't do something fast, it's going to be way too late to do it. But we're going to come back and solve that problem in just a minute. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to the website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. If you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or you have a podcast, or you're involved with an educational system that has an intra-campus television hookup, you just have a computer, you like our programs, please feel free to share them. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're talking to a veteran observer of the United Nations, Dr. Robert Zuber, who has covered many issues at the UN. Bob, we've got, before we run out of time, we've got to talk a little bit about the challenges before the United Nations. And climate change, obviously, is one of them. And of course, we saw on October 7th, this horrific carnage that took place in Israel. The United Nations has been working, I know, since 1947, when the UN created Israel and Palestine, a two-state situation. And the UN has been working to try to resolve that very sticky, thorny issue since then. You look at, but what's happening now, of course, what we say today will be out of date tomorrow, but what machinery at the UN, what role can what role can the Security Council play to try to help mitigate this problem? Is there a role for UN peacekeepers if they ever set up a two-state solution? And this invasion is going to, I think, harden both sides, the sides that want a two-state solution and the ones who just don't want but one state or no state, to be quite honest, such as Prime Minister Netanyahu. But what role can the UN play in this as far as trying to overcome this horrific situation?
Yeah, that's a gigantic question, and as you say, it will change tomorrow, right before our eyes. I think one of the things, and our the new agenda for peace highlights this, is that there's more peace and security related architecture in the UN than there used to be. The General Assembly is more active. The Liechtenstein supported resolution in the GA to hold the Security Council members exercising vetoes and have them come before the GA to explain why they did it and have the rest of the membership weigh in on it. I think that's an important initiative. The Peacebuilding Commission has really done a good job. It's underfunded, but it attracts A-list diplomats who are really concerned about the UN's footprint in the peace and security area. And what most of these diplomats have in common, although they have different ideas about what should be done, is that they're very interested in Security Council reform. Some of them focusing on working methods, some of them focusing on membership and how many permanent members and where they come from, and how many non-permanent members and where they come from and their terms, et cetera, et cetera. There's a growing dissatisfaction with the council. I think, legitimately so. If you look at council resolutions in terms of how many of them are implemented, and the ones that aren't implemented, why they aren't implemented, and then you see all these client-state relationships. You see large states covering up for smaller ones who are part of their orbits. And it's very frustrating. And I made a comment that you picked up on the last time we talked, about the former president of the General Assembly, Kuroshi, in his final remarks to the General Assembly, urging the Assembly to make resolutions you can be proud of. And by that, he did not mean consensus, which is more problematic than a lot of delegations tend to think it is. But what he meant is resolutions that matter to the constituents who look at these things and expect something in the world to change as a result of them. And when something doesn't change as the result of them, they shake their heads and they wonder about the UN's legitimacy and why they bother, et cetera, et cetera. In fairness, the diplomats in New York they're not mandated to worry about implementation. Their job is to create language that states can agree to. And to some extent, that's true in the Security Council as well. But the Security Council has many more tools, especially coercive ones, at its disposal, and not only coercive ones. Special political missions, all kinds of things that where they can work with the SG to negotiate and try to resolve and prevent conflict. So and I don't think that the Security Council really uses all the tools in its toolbox as effectively as they could. But the Security Council is and remains the most political space in a political building. And so they're a bit, every time someone makes a move, there's some, the Ukraine discussions, it's important for this war to end, but the discussions tend to be partisan and political and conspiracy theorizing all over the place, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that until the UN understands the promises that are represented by resolutions, whether they're in the Council or in the GA or in ECOSOC or with the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN is going to have some kind of a credibility problem. It's going to be really, really difficult, including for the Council.
And what I've noticed over the years, maybe you have, or maybe I'm wrong, that so many people, both inside the UN and outside the UN, first off, want to give it more power than it really has. So often I've heard journalists say, well, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? Well, they're limited as to what they can do because they're not a one world government. And then so many of the governments and outsiders too want to blame the United Nations for inaction or the fact that a project failed or a peacekeeping mission had problems. Now, there's some cases where the UN does deserve the blame, no doubt about that. But I know, just in my own sort of ad hominem way of looking back and my interaction with folks, politicians and business people and what have you, that I discovered that a large number of them really did not understand the United Nations. They did not understand it. They supported it to a large degree. They feel it was necessary, but they really didn't know what was going on. It is, as you mentioned a minute ago, it's very complex what happens. And it's not just in New York, but we're talking about throughout the whole UN system, where you're helping to move aircraft, ships, mail, weather information, the International Telecommunications Union. Those are all vital agencies that help us in the United States. And we know nothing about them, or very little. There are very few people.
I agree completely, Bill. That's very, very good.
What can be done to help people better understand the UN and its limitations and its strengths?
Well, I mean, I think in general, and this is a problem within nations as well as for the UN itself, I think people are more likely to understand things that are tangible to them. And so, if you're sitting in South Sudan somewhere, that your opinion of the UN is likely to be determined by whether or not UNMISS is able to provide protection for your village and your family, or whether the relief agencies are able to gain access to your community to provide provisions, right? It's practical.
Exactly.
And a lot of the resolutions, a lot of the work that the UN does is kind of from a pragmatic standpoint is dead on arrival. It sets a norm, and norms are helpful. I believe in them, and I believe in the UN's capacity to make them and its ability to make them. But if you are in trouble, when I was helping to pastor a church in Harlem during the crack years, I mean, theoretically, it's nice to know that there's a police presence that are gonna show up if there's a crime, but the police need to show up if there's a crime, right? It's the tangibility factor. It's like making sure that there is that resolutions have a tail, and that people can see what they're going to do practically. And part of the UN's dilemma, I think, is that in many instances, the nations that are most likely to fulfill the resolutions passed by the UN are the nations that are already fulfilling the resolutions passed by the UN. In other words, they're already doing the thing, right? And so the question is, what do those resolutions have by way of being able to nurture more action that's consistent with the resolution on the part of states that aren't inclined to abide by the resolution?
Exactly.
That's the problem.
It's the problem. And you're absolutely right. You mentioned UNMISS, the United Nations mission in South Sudan, that people on the ground see it. I've talked to refugees who come to the United States from the Democratic Republic of Congo, who speak glowingly of UNICEF, the World Health Organization, the refugee program, just on across the board. When people see how their lives are directly impacted, it makes a world of difference. Just like
Absolutely.
We've used this several times to talk about Ukraine. Security Council has been paralyzed. It's been criticized, I think rightly so, but you have that whole panoply of UN agencies UN Children's Fund, the World Health Organization, on the ground working to keep Ukrainians alive and to help them. The World Food Program, the list goes on and on. And that's another side of the UN that we seldom see or seldom hear anything about, but it's out there. But Dr. Bob Zuber, we're going to have to pick this up later. We've just run out of time.
Oh, that's all right.
Bob, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Great to see you again, Bill.
Thank you. Same to see you. Great to see you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.